My name is Marcus Hale. I'm 41 years old and I clean hallways most people aren't allowed to know exist. The job came through a subcontractor with ties I don't fully understand. They flew me in blindfolded from Fairbanks, dropped me at an outpost with no signage, and sent me down a freight elevator that didn't stop descending for 3 full minutes. They told me I'd be working night shift only 5 days a week, with full hazard pay. They didn't mention what kind of hazards. For the first 3 weeks, the work was mindless but oddly peaceful. I kept the waste compartments sterile, monitored pressure gauges in the lower corridors, and scrubbed floors that no one walked on. I rarely saw anyone. The facility operates on a skeleton crew, consisting mostly of research staff and a rotating pair of medics. Everyone keeps to themselves. There's no cell service, no outside contact, and no real need for conversation. That suited me just fine. I've always done better in silence. Then, on the 22nd night, something slid under my door. It was a thin gray envelope with my name printed on it, typed in all caps. There was no return address or signature. A title appeared on the first page: Behavioral Contingency Protocols, Non-Essential Night Personnel. I opened it, thinking it was a new safety update or chemical procedure. It wasn't. Inside were 9 rules, each one numbered, each one printed in the same font as my initial onboarding documents. But these weren't standard safety protocols. They didn't explain procedures or outline checklists. They were written like instructions you'd give to someone walking into a minefield. Rule 1 stated that staff were not permitted in service sub-level D after 2 a.m. without written authorization. That one didn't surprise me. Most restricted areas in places like this have timing thresholds. Rule 2 instructed me to always greet personnel by their full name and report if they hesitated to return it. That felt more like a psychological test than etiquette. Rule 3 warned against making eye contact with reflections past midnight. I didn't know whether that meant mirrored surfaces or surveillance feeds, but it lodged in my mind. Rule 4 told me to log the timestamp of any static on monitors, but never rewind footage. I didn't like the way that one was worded. Rule 5 advised securing any unaccompanied lab coats found in motion using something called Emergency Clamp Protocol, which I had never heard of and wasn't trained to perform. Rule 6 said to ignore any knocking from sealed compartments. I paused a bit on that one. Rule 7 insisted that if any internal doors opened without biometric input, I should remain still for a full minute. I wasn't supposed to close them or investigate anything. I just had to stay still. Rule 8 demanded the disposal of indoor ice formations using thermal shrouds only. I didn't even know what a thermal shroud looked like. And Rule 9 told me to report any internal frost and hide in Locker 3, not the nearest shelter, not even the main exit. Locker 3 specifically. I read the list twice, then I folded the pages back into the envelope and placed it under my pillow. I told myself it was some sort of psychological evaluation, maybe a test of compliance or discipline. But the silence in the hallway that night felt heavier than usual. The air wasn't colder, but it sat differently in my lungs. Around 3:10 a.m., while sweeping near the coolant chambers, I heard a faint tapping sound. The sound was quiet and deliberate, like someone gently rapping on a steel panel with the tip of their nail. The sound came from behind a sealed compartment door marked "No Access, Environmental Hazard." I paused, broom still in hand, and waited. The tapping stopped after 12 seconds. I resisted the urge to approach the door, kept silent, and continued my route without breaking stride. Later that shift, I passed Corridor Delta 4 and noticed a streak of condensation running along the inside of the observation glass. It resembled fog more than frost, as if breath had briefly clung to the surface and then vanished, leaving behind faint branching residues like veins or roots. I checked the internal sensors, expecting at least a minor anomaly, but there was nothing out of range. There were no alarms or alerts, only that strange mark and the awareness that this had come mere hours after the rules were introduced. It felt less like a coincidence and more like the rules were being tested through me. I stood there a moment, longer, not sure what action I was meant to take, and eventually moved on because there was nothing else I could do. At 5:40 a.m., as I was logging out for the night, I saw Dr. Emmerich near the lift. He's part of the bioanalysis team, mostly runs samples through quantum interference matrices and data filters I don't understand. We've crossed paths a few times before, but I've never heard him say much. I nodded. He stared back without blinking, then said, "Safe rounds, Marcus." His voice was flat, as if reciting something rather than speaking to me. At breakfast the next evening, he greeted me again with the exact same phrase. Same tone, same pace. No recognition in his eyes. It could have been a coincidence, a quirk of habit. However, something about the repetition made me feel as though I was being watched. That was when I reread Rule 2. I considered using it as a kind of exercise, a way to test whether these rules were merely bureaucratic fiction or something more. The idea of applying it in practice gave me a brief sense of control, as if I could make sense of this place by following instructions. But when I imagined what might happen if I reported him, that confidence cracked. What if the repetition wasn't a mistake? What if it wasn't him at all? I haven't spoken to Dr. Emmerich since. I haven't spoken to anyone. The rules haven't been mentioned by anyone else. There was no official memo, meeting, or explanation. The envelope remains under my pillow, and I keep the envelope under my pillow and find myself checking it more often than I care to admit. Before each shift, I glance at a rule or two, sometimes 3, not always in order. I tell myself it's to stay sharp, to follow procedure, but there's something else behind it, a need to stay aligned with something known, no matter how unsettling the instructions are. They've become a ritual of sorts, a way to impose structure over the things I can't explain. Since they arrived, I've started noticing things that don't quite belong. Not dangerous things, just things that suggest there's more happening here than I'm meant to know. A door left ajar that's always locked, a window reflection that doesn't match the angle, a corridor that feels a little too silent, even for this place. I used to think this was just a cold, strange job. It had its oddities, sure, but nothing I couldn't file away as part of the isolation. Now it feels different in a way I can't quite put into words. Since the arrival of those rules, the air carries a new weight, as if the facility has shifted into something unfamiliar. I find myself glancing over my shoulder more often, noticing patterns in silence that weren't there before. This place has changed in a way that leaves me uneasy. I have the sense that difficult days are ahead, and I don't know yet how to meet them. The morning after the fogged glass and the soft knocking, I woke up early but didn't feel rested. Before the rules, mornings blurred together. I'd get dressed, collect my cart, and walk my route like clockwork. Since the envelope arrived, I noticed small changes, how long I paused before opening the door, how often I checked the corners of the mirror when brushing my teeth. I still followed the routine, but the simplicity had been replaced by awareness. Nothing had happened, not really, but something felt thinner now, like a layer had peeled back. I didn't feel watched exactly, but I'd started acting as if I was. I got ready a little more deliberately that morning, checked the time twice, and gave a longer look at the rules before slipping them back into the drawer. The change in my routine came with a simple slip of paper, signed at the bottom by a name I didn't recognize. My route had been expanded to include observation B level on alternating nights. The note claimed the prior janitorial rotation had been reassigned. The shift in protocol arrived without warning, a silent update delivered without explanation or consultation. Observation B level was different from the rest of the facility. I'd passed it before, sealed off behind thick thermal doors and steel shutters that only opened with a timed override. It was one of those wings that always felt off limits by design, sealed, specialized, and not part of my job. The area sat adjacent to the geothermal stabilization ring, a curved corridor of reinforced glass panels that gave full view into cryo sample chambers. I had no business near that wing until now. I found myself wondering why the cleaning responsibility had suddenly shifted to me. What happened to the last rotation? Why now, after weeks of predictable routing? The logs showed nothing unusual, no mention of malfunction or emergency protocol. The reassignment simply appeared, subtle and unexplained, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been calculated with me in mind. I reviewed my task log. The new edition included detailed cleaning instructions for the panels, floor sensors, and a set of bio-containment locks I wasn't authorized to open. That alone should have raised a red flag, but I'd stopped expecting logical workflows in this place. I worked where they told me. I touched what I was allowed to touch. Before leaving my quarters, I checked the envelope. Rule 3. Avoid all eye contact with reflections past midnight. It came back to me sharp and vivid, like it had been waiting. I read it again, slower this time. The rule unsettled me now in a way it hadn't before. I would be entering a space lined with panels, metal doors, equipment casings, and the long curve of cryoglass, all of it capable of producing reflections, some subtle, others sharp and vivid. It occurred to me that avoiding eye contact in such a place might be more than difficult. It might be impossible. I had been given this new assignment just after this rule appeared. I began to wonder if that was a coincidence or if someone wanted to see what would happen when both variables were active. I packed a cloth square in my pocket, telling myself it was for fingerprints and smudges, but I already knew I'd be using it on glass I didn't want to look into. I didn't feel scared exactly, but something in the structure of the rule felt too specific, like it had been designed to fail. At 11:52 p.m., I entered B-level using a backup keycard that had been delivered with the route change. The corridor opened with a hydraulic hiss, flooding my path with light from the sample chambers. Bright, cold, and sterile, the entire wing smelled faintly of ozone and alcohol. The air was several degrees cooler here, though the systems didn't acknowledge it. I kept my gaze low, focusing on the metal grates below my boots. Reflections were peripheral. As I cleaned, I hummed softly, a habit from childhood, when I wanted to drown out noise I couldn't name. By 12:17 a.m., I reached the main arc of the viewing corridor. This section curved outward in a slow bend, lined with convex panels that reflected and warped the hallway into an endless mirrored tunnel. I stayed focused on the work. Wipe, step, inspect. But one panel near Chamber 6 caught my eye. It wasn't the movement that drew my attention, but something missing. The reflection didn't match what I expected to see. In the panel, I saw myself, but my skin was pale, almost colorless. My lips were tinged blue. My eyes looked glassy and still, like frozen spheres. The reflection didn't move or blink. It appeared frozen in place, arms at my sides, mouth slightly parted. Behind the glass, my breath did not fog. My first instinct was to look over my shoulder, to verify my presence. But I didn't move. I knew better. I kept my body still, eyes fixed on the floor tiles, and slowly backed away. My pulse was hammering. I reached the junction of Corridor Delta and stopped beneath the camera mount. I had passed that panel dozens of times from a distance, never like that. I waited until I couldn't hear the hum of the chamber doors anymore. Only then did I glance briefly at the rules again. Rule 3 was still there, still unexplained, and now I understood it hadn't been superstition. It was a warning, shaped by experience, passed down for those who'd stood where I just had. But what exactly had I seen? Was it a malfunction in the glass, a trick of low blood sugar? Or had I glimpsed something impossible myself, drained of color and breath, paused like a wax figure waiting to be activated? It stayed with me long after I backed away. That wasn't how reflections behaved. I ran through scenarios in my mind, trying to find a rational framework, but none of them held. If that thing was me, it raised one question I couldn't shake. What version of myself would exist if I broke a rule? And worse, had I already? The silence in the corridor felt heavier now, as if it had absorbed the moment, too. From then on, every glance at a reflective surface came with a pulse of doubt. Was it following my lead or studying me for weakness? After I completed my route on B level, I exited through the south bulkhead and started back toward the main sanitation hub. I was scanning the checklist on my pad when I noticed a shimmer at the corner of my vision. The metal frame around locker corridor 4 had frost gathering along the lower seams. That shouldn't have been possible. The internal climate systems kept all corridors well above freezing. I stepped closer. The frost wasn't uniform. It bloomed outward in long, crystalline spines. I blinked hard, thinking maybe I was misreading some kind of surface grime or light diffraction. But when I touched the frame, it was cold. It bit at my fingertips with a sharpness that felt unnatural for this corridor. A bloom of condensation formed on the reinforced glass panel beside it. As I backed away, words began to form within the fog. Let me go home. I stood frozen, staring at the words. I understood them too well, and that's what made them terrifying. The handwriting looked almost human, slanted, hurried. I could see each stroke as if written by a fingertip from the other side. There was no one there. I dropped the pad. My legs moved on instinct. I turned and ran toward the comm booth 2 corridors over. The terminal glitched as I activated it, and I hit the override to open the direct report channel. Control, this is Custodial Unit 6 requesting emergency verification. I've got internal frost forming in Corridor 4. Possible containment breach. Silence. I waited, heart slamming. Control, please confirm. Corridor 4 is showing frost. Repeat, internal frost. A pause. Then a voice replied, calm, almost sleepy. Understood. Proceed to Shelter 3. The voice remained steady and low, its tone resembling someone acknowledging a routine systems check. Its voice remained measured, with no sense of urgency or added instruction, only an acknowledgement that suggested this event fell well within their expectations. The way it responded gave the impression that what I had witnessed wasn't unusual here, that internal frost and fog-written messages were nothing unexpected within the framework of this facility. I didn't wait. I sprinted past the admin terminal, took the first left at Beta Loop, and slid the access card into Shelter 3's scanner. The door unlatched. I ducked inside. Shelter 3 was a repurposed decontamination vault fitted with a cot, a battery lantern, and a small insulated window. I pressed my ear to the metal wall and waited. Footsteps, dull and even, followed by the distinct tone of a stabilizer probe locking into position. A hiss of cryogas. I heard 2 voices outside the shelter door, their tones measured and professional. They spoke in short, practiced phrases that overlapped slightly, the kind of exchange you might expect from technicians following a well-rehearsed containment drill. I couldn't make out the words, but the cadence told me they weren't panicking. They were performing a task, likely something with the stabilizers or a cryo patch. The air pressure shifted faintly. A locking sound clicked, followed by another hiss that came in 2 steady bursts, deliberate in its timing and oddly rhythmic. Then, everything went quiet again. I stayed inside for nearly 30 minutes before I risked the hatch. When I stepped back into the corridor, the frost was gone, every seam dry. The condensation had vanished. The message was no longer there. Rule 9 had been clear. Report the frost. Hide in Locker 3. And now I knew why. But one thing wouldn't leave my mind: the handwriting. It wasn't a malfunction or environmental cue. It was deliberate. Someone or something had shaped those words with purpose. But what did it mean? Was there someone inside this facility trying to communicate, begging to be released? Or had something else used the fog as a channel, mimicking desperation to provoke a response? The message felt intimate, too personal to ignore. It didn't say, "Let us go home." It said, "Let me." Singular. Directed. I couldn't tell if it was meant for whoever might read it, or if somehow, impossibly, it was meant for me. The thought clawed at me in the silence. What if I wasn't just witnessing containment breakdowns? What if something here believed I was the key to its escape? And if that were true, then what exactly was being kept in? At 4:15 a.m., I sat in the commissary, stirring lukewarm coffee that had begun to form a film over the surface. The table surface felt slightly tacky, the way laminate does when it's been wiped, but not really cleaned. Around me, the room buzzed faintly with the ambient hum of overhead lights and coolant lines. No one else was there yet. My shift didn't technically start for another 20 minutes, but I'd been waking earlier since the locker incident. The message still lingered in the corners of my thoughts. Let me go home. It had formed in the fog like something whispered across dimensions, soft and urgent. I didn't talk about it. There was no one to talk to. And besides, the last time I mentioned a rule-triggered event, the person I'd described was gone within the hour. I'd been given new clearance again. Maintenance protocols for the data relay junctions in Sector F. The terminal read, "Temporary reassignment." There was no reason. There was never a reason. At 4:38 a.m., I heard footsteps. I looked up and saw Dr. Emmerich near the coffee dispensers. Same slate-gray lab coat, same deep-set fatigue in his expression. He nodded in my direction. "Morning, Dr. Emmerich," I said without thinking, watching closely. He didn't respond right away. Something in his shoulders shifted, as if recalibrating. I hesitated, then made a choice. "Good morning, Dr. Calvin Emmerich." This time, he stopped moving altogether. The pause was longer than before. His mouth opened slightly, as though searching for a remembered phrase. Then, "Safe rounds, Marcus." The tone was identical to last time, but the delay was clearer now. It hadn't been just tiredness. It hadn't been a coincidence. I sipped my coffee and kept my face still. The rule came back to me like a pulse. If they hesitate, report. I waited until he left, then walked to the maintenance booth outside the commissary. I keyed in my code, activated the secure channel, and submitted an incident report. Category: Behavioral Irregularity. Subject: Emmerich, Calvin D. No one responded, but 20 minutes later, as I walked past Corridor Theta, I saw 2 security officers standing at the far end, their posture too casual to be natural. Emmerich emerged from the lab junction. They flanked him, spoke briefly, and he hesitated. His feet didn't move at first. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the almost imperceptible tremor in his posture. When he finally stepped forward, he didn't comply out of understanding. He moved with the hesitation of someone confused, maybe fear masking itself as obedience. The officers remained close, ushering him silently. As they disappeared around the corner, I caught a final glimpse of his face. His eyes searched the hallway, scanning for something or someone, before settling briefly on mine. There was no anger there, only bewilderment, and the unmistakable look of someone who knew they were being erased from something they couldn't even name. I stood frozen, the weight of what I'd done anchoring me to the floor. Had I just condemned a man based on a pause? Or had I removed something far more dangerous than I could comprehend? If he wasn't what he seemed, if the thing walking past me at night bore his face, then the report might have saved lives. But if he were just tired, just strange in a place full of strange people, then I'd pulled the trigger on someone who never had a chance. That uncertainty settled in my chest like frost, cold and slow burning. The assignment in Sector F was straightforward. Inspect the stabilizer grids along the cryo buffer rails and verify that the magnetic seals on junction doors were intact. Most of it was routine, lines of blinking lights, temperature differentials that always trended within spec. By 2:55 a.m., I had finished my rounds and was compiling the checklist. The halls were quiet, holding an unnatural calm that pressed against the walls like dense fog, like the whole place was holding its breath. At 2:58 a.m., I passed the auxiliary corridor near Server Vault 5. The overhead lights hummed quietly, their sterile glow washing over everything in a dull, yellow cast. The hallway should have been empty, silent, and predictable. But then the internal door to the vault clicked, a soft, deliberate sound that didn't match any of the familiar access tones. The biometric scanner didn't flash. No confirmation beep followed. The motion lights flickered on like a hesitant breath. The door parted just slightly, 2 inches, enough to see blackness beyond, and then held there. I stopped moving, my boots locked in place against the floor. I remembered Rule 7 with sharp clarity. If any internal doors open without biometric input, remain still for a full minute, exactly 60 seconds of silence and stillness. A cold pulse of fear crawled up my back. My breath thinned. I became hyper-aware of every muscle, every small shift in balance, even the pulse in my fingertips. I didn't dare look toward the opening. My gaze stayed fixed forward, unblinking. The lights inside the vault remained off. The vault remained silent. Mechanical systems stayed inert, with no signs of the usual gears or air circulation engaging. But there was pressure. Something subtle, heavy, hanging just behind my ears, like a low-frequency vibration I couldn't quite hear, but could feel in my teeth. I counted. 10 seconds. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. 20. A draft of cold air brushed past my left hand. The air didn't come from any nearby vent. It arrived with intent, as though something unseen had chosen that exact moment to brush against me. 35. There was motion, a whisper of something gliding across the floor. My peripheral vision caught a shape, tall, narrow, tapering where a person's arms might end, but too long, too smooth. It slid across the narrow band of light just beyond the frame of the door. I didn't blink. My body felt carved from stone. The thing didn't step, it drifted, moving with a fluid grace that ignored the usual rules of balance and momentum, like a marionette manipulated by forces not bound to this world. The second it passed, my chest constricted. The constriction in my chest had nothing to do with relief. It was dread, settling deep and slow like winter ice. I could feel its presence moving along the far wall out of view. Every instinct screamed to run, but the rule was clear. At 58 seconds, the door slowly sealed itself again. The locks reset with a faint internal snap, and the biometric panel lit up red, back to standby. I exhaled. It came out shaky, shallow. My limbs ached from holding a position. I forced myself to walk, but each step felt unnatural, like I was wading through sand. By the time I reached the main corridor, I could barely feel my feet. At 3:17 a.m., I accessed the system terminal near the security node. I pulled up the log entries for Server Vault 5. It loaded after a delay. I kept trying to replay the scene in my head. The movement I'd seen, that gliding way it passed through the light without lifting or shifting weight like a person should, was unlike anything I'd encountered in the facility. I thought about the shape, tall, elongated, and too fluid to be someone in uniform. It hadn't made a sound, and yet its presence had weight. Was it a person altered by something in this place? A projection? A denizen from deeper within the ice? My hands hovered over the keyboard as I tried to make sense of what I had seen. A shape, fluid and silent, had crossed the narrow light gap of Server Vault 5. The memory played back in my head in fragments. Its height, the way it moved without steps, how the air had shifted around it. Nothing in the facility's design accounted for such an encounter. I had no log to back it up. The system showed no record of access, no alerts, and no biometric activity. The hallway had supposedly remained empty, yet I knew what I had felt. The weight in the air, the shift in pressure. the motion that didn't belong to any human I'd ever worked with. I questioned whether it was a malfunction of my senses, some byproduct of sleep debt or tension, but the clarity of the moment refused to fade. The system displayed an empty record. There were no badge scans, no access approvals, and no overrides listed. I couldn't reconcile it with what I'd seen. The vault had been entered. I closed the terminal slowly. My hand brushed the console's edge, cool and solid beneath my fingers, anchoring me in a place that no longer felt real. Later, in the records annex, I passed by a reflective panel mounted above the fire suppression console. My face looked drawn, paler than I remembered, as if the figure from earlier had drained all the warmth from my skin. The blood no longer seemed to flow right beneath the surface. I touched my cheek, expecting it to feel frozen, but my eyes were focused, alive. I tapped the screen beside the panel and accessed my route history. Dr. Emmerich's name was gone. Dr. Emmerich's name had vanished from every record I checked. There were no active assignments, no archived communications, and nothing in the maintenance logs to suggest he had ever been there. Every indicator of his presence in the facility had been scrubbed clean. I scrolled back, double-checked spelling, and even switched filters. It was all the same. Blank space where a person had once been recorded. I leaned back from the console, eyes unfocused, the screen casting a pale blue wash across the wall. In the dim light, I caught my reflection in the glass of the fire suppression panel. My face looked off, paler than usual, drawn in a way that reminded me of the chill I felt earlier, outside Server Vault 5. I hadn't seen anything touch me, but standing in the corridor, something had slipped unnervingly close. And now I felt the aftermath. It was in my skin, drained of warmth, as if the cold itself had burrowed beneath the surface and taken root. My cheeks lacked color, and the usual pulse of heat under my eyes had dulled. I touched the hollow beneath my eye, half expecting frost. It wasn't fear or fatigue. It was the residue of presence, something intangible but deeply felt. Whatever had moved through that space, it hadn't been idle, and now I was marked by its passing. Had Dr. Emmerich been taken because he wasn't who he appeared to be? Or had I just silenced someone who moved differently, spoke too slowly, remembered the wrong things? As I stood there trying to settle the rising sense of uncertainty, I noticed again how cold my fingers had become, and in the glass, the image of my pale face stared back, unchanged. For now. By the time the night reached 1:12 a.m., something in the air had changed. I'd been on my feet for hours already, pacing familiar corridors that had started to feel unfamiliar in their silence. The chill had deepened gradually, seeping into my joints in a way that makes you keep your gloves on long after you've forgotten why. The vents made odd pauses between breaths, like they were unsure of themselves. Every surface felt a little off, like the walls were holding something in they didn't want to share. My focus was dull, running a checklist of numbers on a valve in corridor J14, when a flicker of movement pulled me from routine. Down the hallway, near the bend, something white brushed the floor, slow, measured. It wasn't a person, nor did it make any sound. There was only the smooth whisper of fabric brushing along the floor. At first, I thought it was a loose data sheet or a lab napkin that had fallen, but as I got closer, the shape elongated, flattened, then swayed. A lab coat, unaccompanied. It glided more than it moved, like caught in a low drift of air, despite there being none. My mind jumped immediately to Rule 5. Secure any unaccompanied lab coats found in motion using emergency clamp protocol. But in all my time here, no one had ever explained what the emergency clamp protocol was. I stood in the middle of the hall, coat halfway down the passage, and realized I was utterly unprepared for what I was seeing. I hadn't even known such a situation was possible. My clearance included sanitation procedures, minor mechanical resets, and environmental monitoring, but not this. The coat turned left at an intersection without pause. I didn't follow right away. I checked the wall console for guidelines or help menus. Nothing. I tried the internal help directory, searching emergency clamp protocol. Access restricted. Authorization tier required. Uncertain of how to proceed and with no access to protocol specifics, I stepped back and opened a comm channel. I called it in. Maintenance command responded with static at first, then a clipped reply. Confirmed anomaly in corridor J14. Engage standard isolation until team arrival. What does that mean? I asked. Containment tools are in storage B3. Do not engage with the garment directly. The line was cut. Storage B3 wasn't far, but my walk there was stiff and rapid. I found a box labeled ECP beneath bundled thermal blankets. Inside, a clamp gun that looked like a hybrid between a staple tool and a harpoon launcher waited, marked with strange calibration notches. I practiced deploying it once against an empty cart. The mechanism hissed and bit hard. Then I moved. The lab coat had stopped at a dead end near Cryo Locker 17. No windows, just a wall and the quietly shifting garment hovering 6 inches off the floor, turning slightly like it was hanging in slow water. I lifted the clamp gun and aimed at the collar. It flinched. I fired. The clamps shot out and gripped the fabric with a snapping jerk, pinning it to the concrete. The hallway went completely silent. The ventilation had stopped, and I couldn't hear even the faintest hum from the wall panels. I stayed still for a few seconds, waiting for any movement or sound from the coat, but it didn't shift again. The clamps had fixed it to the floor like a pinned insect. I slowly stepped closer, trying to understand how a simple piece of clothing could behave with such intent. The motion had ceased entirely, and now it hung limp. Whatever force had been moving, it was gone. When I approached to inspect it, I saw something bulging from the inner pocket, a soaked piece of paper. I pried it loose. The ink had bled away, except for a single intact line written in tight, clear strokes. He never left. I stared at the words, my hands damp from the soaked paper, heart ticking hard against my ribs. It sounded like a warning or a clue, but its meaning folded in on itself the longer I looked. Who was he? Was this about Dr. Emmerich? If so, had someone left this message recently, or had it been sitting in that pocket, drifting through the corridors for who knows how long? And why now? The hallway was empty, the air still, but something in the back of my mind whispered that I had just stumbled into the middle of something that wasn't over, maybe never had been, and I was now part of it, whether I understood it or not. Before leaving the scene, I tagged the coat's location on the maintenance log and sealed off the corridor with a localized lockdown. 20 minutes later, 2 members from the retrieval division arrived. They wore full thermal suits and face shields. Without asking questions, they unpacked a containment pod, detached the clamps carefully, and slid the coat, still limp, into a polymer case lined with frost-resistant lining. One of them noted the pocket contents without comment. They left without a word. They offered no context, asked nothing about what I had seen. Their movements were practiced and calm, the process clearly routine, deliberate removal. At 2:03 a.m., the alert window blinked red on my terminal. Unauthorized motion detected. Sublevel D. I wasn't assigned to sublevel D. Few were. Its entries were controlled through biometric codes and second-stage manual confirmation. I'd heard the phrase tossed around before: containment ring, relic staging, words that meant nothing without context. But now my credentials blinked green. I had clearance, temporary, logged at 1:59 a.m. I stared at it for a full 30 seconds. Then I scanned in. The door hissed open slower than usual. The air inside was thicker, humid like a greenhouse, but cold in a way that clung to the throat. The lights flickered on low power mode, barely illuminating the hallway. It felt less like a corridor and more like a preserved ruin. The walls were lined with opaque panels. Frost spread between the seams. Some of the lights had frozen in half illumination. A noise echoed, slow, dripping water. I passed by open glass tanks, empty but streaked with internal scratches. Whatever had been inside had fought to stay. Further in, I found a pressure bulkhead slightly ajar. Beyond it, the temperature dropped sharply. I felt it in my teeth. Then I saw it. A figure. Seated in the far corner, limbs tangled, head bowed. Encased in thick ice that still shimmered faintly with electric veins. The face was distorted, partially hidden by the frost, but it was unmistakably human, or had once been. A nameplate lay nearby. Dr. Calvin Emmerich. I didn't speak, couldn't move. I just stood there, knowing what I'd seen this morning in the commissary. The man who had sipped coffee, hesitated, and spoken in borrowed cadence. The same man I'd reported. But here he was, frozen, unmoving, not gone, not erased. He never left. I stood motionless, cold biting through my gloves, staring at Emmerich's body locked in the ice. The sight alone was impossible to explain, but it was the access that disturbed me most. I hadn't overridden anything. I hadn't been given new instructions. The clearance had just appeared. Rule 1 was clear. No one was allowed in sub-level D after 2 a.m. without written authorization. And yet here I was. Why was I allowed in? What purpose did it serve for me to see Emmerich like this? I thought about the coat, the note, the gliding motion in the hallway. The access didn't feel like a technical error. It felt intentional. Maybe it wasn't management that wanted me to witness this. Maybe it was those flickering figures I'd glimpsed before, the ones who moved like light, trapped in condensation. The note, the movements, and the frost were not signs of malfunction. They had been arranged with purpose, laid out in a sequence too intentional to ignore, designed for me to witness and absorb. I was being shown something, taught something, and now I was sure this place housed more than scientific secrets. There were others here, not staff, not human, and they were guiding me, testing how much I'd follow, how much I'd question. Maybe the rules weren't absolute, maybe they were meant to be bent. Just as I felt that shift within myself, my decision to stop treating these protocols as scripture, I heard soft footsteps echo behind me. A technician stepped into view, someone I hadn't noticed enter. He glanced at the chamber, at Emmerich in the ice, then at me. "You're not supposed to be in here," he said with no urgency. The technician remained composed, offering no reaction that suggested surprise or expectation of an explanation. He simply gestured toward the exit. I followed him out, and the door sealed behind me. It wasn't the administration that had let me in. It was something else entirely. The same thing that left the note, and now I knew for sure. It wanted me to keep going. The morning didn't feel like morning at all. It was more a continuation of the same sleepless drift. I hadn't truly rested since sub-level D. That place had etched something permanent into the back of my eyes, a kind of frost that didn't melt with heat or time. I'd laid in my bunk, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that all of this still had structure, that the rules were still meant to protect. But that illusion had already cracked. Whatever governed this place no longer aligned with protocol. Something else had stepped in, and I was beginning to feel like I'd been handed to it. I walked the corridor slowly, clipboard in hand, but no real checklist to follow. I kept glancing toward the corners, checking for motion. The feeling had changed. I was still employed here, still wearing the badge, immersed in the logic of daily routines, but I had started to drift from its gravity. Now, I was looking for the other logic. The one that didn't need memos or biometric locks. The one who left messages in pockets and opened doors that shouldn't open. I entered the security substation on level B to run a visual relay check. The room was dimly lit, monitors casting a cold flicker across the consoles. This was routine. Cycle the feeds, log irregularities, move on. I let my eyes adjust as the familiar hum of equipment settled around me. My gaze moved methodically across the screens until one caught. A ripple of static washed over the monitor tuned to corridor K9. For a few seconds, the image dissolved into white noise before stabilizing again. The corridor looked empty, still, but something about the transition lingered too long in my mind. I checked the clock and recorded the timestamp. Rule 4 was clear: log, don't rewind. But the flicker played back in my memory, crisp and undeniable. I moved my hand toward the rewind toggle. Not a decision, more an impulse. A single tap sent the timeline reversing, slow and smooth. The static returned, then paused. For just a moment, a form emerged on the screen. Thin limbs. A pale, faceless body in motion, human in posture, inhuman in proportions. It moved with intent, a direction. I leaned closer, tracing its path along the corridor. My breath slowed. I dropped a marker on the map overlay, noting where it had come from. Then I tapped to reset the footage. Nothing happened. The image stalled, frozen mid-frame. Lines distorted across the monitor like a screen underwater. I pressed reset. The display stuttered, failed to respond. I reached back and pulled the power cable. The monitor faded to black. In the reflection on the glass, my reflection lingered before the light died, half-formed in the fading glow, as if part of it hadn't left yet. I left the station with my pulse knocking against my collar. The hallway outside greeted me with a chill that didn't belong to the air conditioning. It had the density of breath stalled mid-lung, of warmth leaving through skin. As I walked, I tried to keep my pace measured, my thoughts from spiraling. That's when I saw him. A figure in a gray utility coat, walking in the opposite direction, slow and even. One of the bio-recovery interns, I thought. His name tag was tilted sideways, partially obscured, but I recognized his build and the slackness in his gait. Pale face, eyes sunken with a kind of weariness I had started to recognize in myself. As we neared each other, I called out his full name. The way Rule 2 instructed was a clear, steady voice, not lowered or uncertain in tone. He stopped, not abruptly but like a machine powering down, turned his head slightly toward me. His eyelids twitched once, then opened wide. His lips moved, but the answer took time to arrive, strung together with the awkward rhythm of a man reciting something in a language he didn't fully grasp. It was his name, but the voice that carried it lacked warmth. It sounded like an introduction, yet something about it resembled a recording, as though the words were being retrieved rather than spoken with intent. I stood there, blood cooling beneath my skin. Something was wrong with that delay, in that gaze. I waited, frozen, hoping for another cue, a normal follow-up, anything human. It didn't come. He simply resumed walking, steady and unchanged. I fell into step behind him, careful to maintain distance. He gave no sign that he noticed. We moved past supply junctions, through the cross-section leading toward thermal storage. Every so often, his steps hit the floor just slightly off tempo, the faint drag of his left foot not aligning with his stride. I began to count them. 5 perfect steps, 1 uneven. 5 again. I remained behind, silent and alert, not sure what I was following anymore. The man or the pattern in his steps. He didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he gave no sign. We moved through corridor L, then past the thermal shrouding lockers. He took a right toward the auxiliary lift. My boots echoed, soft, deliberate. He never turned around. His pace remained constant. Then he reached a junction. One direction curved left toward the chemical sanitation bays. The other led down to sublevel K. I stopped at the corner. A map lit on the wall next to me, its LED lines tracing the facility's skeletal corridors in cool green. The point where the figure on the monitor had vanished was just ahead on the K-level path. That location lingered in my mind like a pulse behind my eyes. I looked after the staffer. He was already turning the bend to the left, walking as if nothing had happened, as if I had never spoken to him. But the map's glow anchored me. I recalled the way the figure had moved, deliberate and fast, almost pulled by something. I needed to see what had drawn it. If there were answers, they would not come from following staff who might not be who they appeared to be. The corridor from the monitor held potential, a tether to the unknown that no longer frightened me, but pulled at me. So I turned right. The corridor was quiet, darker than the others, the overhead lights dimmer. I traced the path with careful steps. Each door I passed was sealed. No movement inside, no sound. Then I came to a shallow stairwell that dipped slightly. At the bottom, the air shifted. That's where I saw it. On the ceiling, a sharp branching structure of ice, thin and vertical like a bloom in reverse, stretching down into the corridor, casting a pale halo on the floor. There was no visible leak and no vent positioned above. The formation stood alone, suspended in air as if grown from nothing. Perfect symmetry. Glass clear. Rule 8 returned to me sharply. Indoor ice formations must be removed with thermal shrouds only. I'd seen the term on the supply list before, but never needed to use one. I didn't even know what it looked like. I checked the inventory. There was a shroud locker not far, labeled Cryo, Maintenance Tools. I made my way there, opened it. Inside, several folded thermal sheets with heating coils woven into the lining. Nothing fancy, no instructions. I turned, walked back toward the ice. Halfway there, I paused and reconsidered. I didn't need to remove it. What I needed was information. I spotted another technician passing near the locker bay and waved him over. "Hey," I said. "I found a structure. Mid-level freeze bloom, probably over 45 inches. I think it's a formation breach, but I've never handled one. You know the protocol?" He nodded and stepped in behind me. "Thermal shroud wrap, base to root. Hold for 10 seconds minimum. That usually dislodges it." "Could you show me? Please? I've never done it before, and they just gave me another job, too. I'm already behind." He sighed, shifting his weight slightly. "Again? They're pushing us tonight." It made me wonder whether tonight was different, whether something was happening I wasn't supposed to see. The question lingered in the back of my mind, yet it didn't pull me away from what I needed to do. I kept moving toward the formation, toward the next step. "I know. I didn't ask for this one either," I muttered, half under my breath. "Can you just walk me through it?" He took the shroud from my hands with a tired motion and moved ahead, grumbling something about overwork as he led the way. I followed closely, but not to the formation. I watched as he stepped beneath the frost and unfolded the wrap. And then I turned. The direction the figure on the monitor had taken was only a few steps further. A sealed utility hatch stood slightly ajar, just enough to allow air to pass. It hadn't been listed as open on the maintenance sheet. I moved toward it. Behind me, the technician kept talking, his voice muffled by distance and routine. He explained what he was doing, assuming I was still there. I glanced back, half expecting him to turn and call me out. My pulse quickened. If he noticed I was gone, would he report it? Would it look like I was interfering, or worse, trespassing? The rules didn't allow wandering from assigned duties. I hesitated, foot still half turned toward him, but he didn't look up. He kept working, unaware. I stepped further away, as quietly as I could manage. I crouched at the hatch, pressed one hand to the floor for balance. The air from inside was colder than the corridor, but it didn't bite like before. It felt settled, as though the cold had chosen this space to rest in. There was a rhythm to the darkness beyond. The pulse wasn't mechanical or electrical. A low pulse, distant but steady, like breath beneath layers of stone. I leaned in further, one eye catching the shimmer of something that had no light or shadow to define it, yet its shape was certain. It remained still, unyielding in presence, waiting with purpose. This space extended further than I'd expected. The hallway beyond wasn't just a sealed corner or forgotten tunnel. It continued. With each step, I felt a subtle gravity, as if something was drawing me in, not by force, but by invitation. And I realized something I hadn't dared admit until now. Whatever was guiding me didn't feel hostile, but I still couldn't be sure if it was safe. It seemed to wait for me, to watch, with a kind of silent understanding. Maybe it wanted me to find it. Maybe it needed me to. But I couldn't tell if it was offering help or waiting for something it needed. Still, I felt myself choosing. I wasn't just being led anymore. I wanted to follow. So I did. The tunnel ahead felt alive with cold. Not the kind that bit at your skin, but the kind that seeped beneath it, winding through your bones. I hadn't dressed for this kind of chill, and every breath condensed in front of me like a whispered warning. The walls were slick with frost, glistening in the dim light like veins in a frozen skin. My boots cracked against the ice-layered floor, careful, deliberate, as if even sound could shatter the fragile quiet. This was deeper than any area I'd ever seen mapped, deeper than protocol allowed. At the tunnel's end, a soft glow shimmered, diffused and warm, a contradiction in this place. I approached cautiously, the light widening as the corridor opened into a vast chamber. I didn't step in. Not yet. I stayed hidden behind the edge of the archway and leaned just far enough to see. Inside, rows of translucent chambers lined the room like upright sarcophagi. Within each, a figure lay dormant, pale, tall, impossibly thin, limbs too long, faces too smooth. These were the shapes I had seen in reflections, the gait I'd followed in quiet corridors, the voices I had never quite heard. These were the ones who had walked beside me, and between them moved a man in a standard-issue hazmat suit. Clipboard in hand, his movements were careful, measured, like a zookeeper counting animals. He checked vitals, adjusted nozzles, scanned monitors mounted above each pod. I crouched lower behind the column near the door. My heart had started racing, a deep pulse driven by recognition rather than fear. These weren't prisoners or intruders. They explained the rules. Their presence was the key. Rule 2, Rule 7, the frost, the reflections. They weren't anomalies. They were residents. I crawled forward slightly, finding a clearer view of one of the chambers. The being inside was still, its eyes shut, lips parted as if mid-sentence. I stared, unable to turn away. Its face, though alien, held something almost familiar in its geometry. Then the eyes opened. They looked directly into mine. I didn't move. Neither did it. For a moment, time held still between us. The creature tilted its head slightly, not aggressive, but curious. And then slowly, with a subtle release of pressure, its chamber unsealed. Fluid drained silently as the door slid open. The creature stepped out with a fluid grace, its gaze still locked to mine. It turned its head toward the technician, who remained unaware, still focused on inspecting a panel. The system gave no reaction. Alarms stayed silent, monitors steady. Movement went undetected. That absence explained why other doors hadn't triggered earlier. Whatever these beings were, their control surpassed our systems. And then it moved. The strike was silent, swift. One moment, the technician stood unaware. The next, his body convulsed in midair, limbs snapping inward like folding metal. Blood and bone sprayed in a precise radius. The clipboard hit the floor. I gasped, but too late. The creature had already turned back toward me. I should have moved, done anything to signal what I'd just witnessed. My instincts told me to run, to shout for help, to do something other than kneel there in paralysis. Yet I remained rooted to the floor, overwhelmed by the full weight of the sheer enormity of what was unfolding. It wasn't only terror that held me in place. It was a deep, almost instinctive understanding that whatever had just occurred was beyond the bounds of normal action. I watched, breath held, as my thoughts scrambled to decide whether this was a moment of judgment or a strange kind of initiation. Then I heard it, silent, yet undeniable. Not a voice in the traditional sense, but a sensation shaped like thought. It entered my mind with the weight of intention, like a hand pressing gently against memory. Stay. The creature made no sound, no visible motion of its mouth, but the meaning arrived as clearly as spoken words. Help. I whispered, almost to myself, that I didn't know how to help. I didn't know what it expected of me or what was about to unfold. The creature raised one hand slowly and extended its long fingers toward the twisted remains of the technician. A pulse of light emanated from its palm, a cold, pale glow that swept across the broken body. The mangled limbs began to shift. Muscles contracted, bones restructured with audible cracks, skin resealed in smooth lines. Within moments, the figure on the floor stood upright again. It was the technician, down to the last detail, his features eerily accurate, skin bloodless, eyes dull, but undeniably him. The replica turned, unprompted, and moved toward one of the other chambers. With movements that mirrored the real technician, it began pressing controls, unlocking seals. One chamber hissed open, then another. Slowly, methodically, the others began to stir, released into the cold light. I stepped back, trembling. The cold was now unbearable because of the fear spreading beneath my skin, deeper than any cold I'd ever felt. The creature approached me again. It placed one hand gently on my forehead. The trembling stopped. I saw images, memories not mine, chambers filled, beings restrained, pain mapped across synapses, voices speaking of specimens, of containment reliability. These weren't prisoners of war. They were subjects of study, victims of curiosity. And then the message was clear. Open the way. I nodded, barely aware of myself. My limbs moved. I retraced my path up the tunnel, toward the access corridor. I passed security monitors flickering in silence. I passed airlocks still sealed. When I reached the main hall, a reflection caught my eye. I caught my reflection in the smooth surface of a monitor. My skin had turned a pale, unnatural white. The texture looked brittle, as if a fine layer of frost clung to it. My lips had lost all color, taking on a bluish tint, and the veins beneath my skin were faint, barely discernible. The change in my appearance felt deeper, as though my body had begun to mirror the forms I had seen in those chambers. Whatever was happening to me wasn't entirely physical. It seeped from the inside out, echoing the transformation I had witnessed moments ago. A technician rounded the corner and froze mid-step. His eyes landed on me, narrowing with concern. "Hey, are you okay? Your face, you're pale, like you've been outside too long." I opened my mouth to respond, unsure of what to say, my thoughts racing for an explanation I didn't have. Just as the words began to form, movement flickered at the edge of my vision. Something swept forward from behind the technician, moving with swift and deliberate silence. Before he could even register the sound, the figure struck. A blur of limbs and movement collided with him, lifting and twisting his body with terrible precision. The technician's scream was cut short as he crumpled, bones folding unnaturally, flesh tearing. Blood misted the air as the creature's assault ended as quickly as it had begun. The corridor went still. I stood rooted in place, the horror of the moment suspended around me like the cold. My answer died on my lips. I reached the final door, my footsteps heavy with everything I had seen and the choices I had already made. My pulse beat in my ears, but I kept walking as though something had taken root inside me, an understanding, or maybe just resignation. It felt like I was being pulled forward, like completing a task I'd been chosen for. A guard stood beside the entrance, eyes scanning lazily until they landed on me. Someone's down. In Corridor M, blood everywhere. His expression changed as he lifted his comm to report it. My voice had come out calm, rehearsed, almost too smooth. "I'll get help. Stay here," he said. He turned, and the moment his back faced me, I stepped forward, hand already reaching for the panel. It responded to my touch with a soft hiss. The lock disengaged. The door opened. Behind me, alarms began to blare and lights dimmed to a flickering pulse. Screams pierced the air, shrill and dissonant, like the sound of metal tearing apart under immense pressure. People ran in every direction, lab coats flaring as technicians and guards collided in panic, slipping on the frost-slick floors. Orders were shouted, garbled through static-filled radios, but nothing organized took hold. The chaos was spreading faster than anyone could contain, and through it all, the air thickened, filled with a kind of presence that didn't rely on footsteps but pressed in from unseen places. A kind of movement that seemed to press in from all directions, from walls, from vents, from shadows that moved without shape. There was no rhythm, only acceleration, as if the facility itself had become a lung, exhaling every nightmare it had ever stored. I watched from the shadows as they came. They advanced in unison with a stillness that defied chaos. Room by room, corridor by corridor, they swept through, unstoppable. Screams faded into wet gurgles, the sound of metal against flesh, then silence. Blood pooled across the facility's tiled floors, soaking into lab notes and staining pristine walls. Every hallway was slick with it. No guards remained at their posts. No researchers whispered over screens. The hum of machinery continued, indifferent, as the bodies cooled. Not a soul remained. The facility was hollow, purged of life, and I, frozen in place, was its final witness. When the screaming stopped, one of them turned back toward me. Its hand reached forward and rested against my chest. The contact was immediate, but the effect unfolded slowly, like frost creeping over glass. A wave of numbness surged through my body, starting at the point of contact and radiating outward. Muscles locked in place, joints stiffened, and my breath shortened until it became a shallow echo in my throat. My skin lost all color as an unnatural chill seized me from the inside out. I couldn't shiver. I couldn't blink. I was frozen as a cold stillness took hold, transforming my body into a vessel shaped by forces I couldn't resist. My awareness remained intact, trapped behind immobilized eyes. I was still me, but altered, hollowed, and preserved. A sentinel of what I had witnessed, transformed into something between memory and monument. I stood there, a living statue, watching as they stepped through the door and into the world. They didn't flee. They returned to the frost, to whatever called them beneath the ice, and then they were gone. I stood alone. The corridors echoed in stillness, my skin pale, my breath shallow. I remained motionless, as if the weight inside me had sunk too deep to rise again. Everyone had vanished, and I had played a role in that disappearance, a role I could neither justify nor deny. The blood that had painted the walls wasn't on my hands, but it might as well have been. Their escape was my doing. The aftermath was my inheritance. A hollow silence stretched around me, louder than any scream I had heard that night. I tried to tell myself it was over, that the weight pressing down on me would fade. But it didn't. This wasn't freedom. It was a consequence. And yet I couldn't tell who was right. Those who kept these beings caged in frost, dissecting their silence for answers, or the ones who would tear through flesh and steel to return to the cold they called home. I had stood between them and made a choice. Now the halls are quiet. The sirens are still. I walk my rounds beneath dimmed lights and frost-streaked ceilings. My badge still scans. My footsteps still echo. But I carry their voices in my head, and my skin bears the chill of their presence. At least now, no one interferes. No one questions. The facility remains, and I remain within it, alone, watching, waiting.